Welcome back to the third episode of explaining every game that released on PlayStation in my region. This is the third month of the PlayStation 1 in the West, November 1995. There were 13 new releases this month, with some more arcade ports, one of the most influential shooters of all time, multiple sports releases, and a fighting game to dethrone all others. We have a lot to get through, so let's check them out. The first game of the month was a new turn-based strategy game developed by Team 17 Worms. The idea with Worms is simple. You have a team of worms, and your opponent has a team of worms, and you take turns using different weapons and gadgets to defeat the other team and be the last worms standing. It is played from a 2D perspective, and each level is randomly generated, having various biomes and themes to battle within. In terms of movement, you have a few different options, from walking and jumping to using a trampoline and even a teleporting device to get around. There are a multitude of weapons and firepower, and these also destroy parts of the levels, leaving craters and holes that will alter the playfield and can be used strategically. You defeat worms by either depleting their health or knocking them off the map or into the water. The game is incredible fun when played against a friend in its popular 2-player mode, or you can face the AI. What this game does lack, however, is a tutorial mode, so when jumping straight in, it will take some time to get used to its dated controls and physics. Personally, I can't play the original Worms for long periods of time, and it will turn away a lot of players with its archaic controls and visuals. Still, it would be successful enough to receive a flood of sequels that would continue the franchise for decades to come. Our next game, released on the 2nd, Agile Warrior F111X, is the second flight combat game on the PlayStation after Namco's Air Combat in October. It was developed by Black Ops Entertainment and has you piloting the attack plane of the title. It comes with live-action FMV mission briefings, which really give it a proper nostalgic 90s feel. There are a lot of games coming that will have the same live-action cutscenes with some cheesy and cheap acting, but still enjoyable all the same. The gameplay is not quite as exciting, however, as this game is very action heavy. It has arcadey flight combat physics that has you flying around the really low detailed environments, firing at targets and shooting at spinning upgrades for your plane. There's some really short render distance here, with you noticing a lot of popping only a few hundred feet in front of you. What I will say though is Agile Warrior does have a pretty awesome heavy rock soundtrack that does at least make it enjoyable in short bursts. Now on the 7th, Namco was back with their third arcade to console port with Tekken. This was Namco's answer to Sega's Virtua Fighter and would quickly topple Battle Arena Toshinden as top fighting game on the PlayStation. Exclusive to this console version was a CG intro to help introduce the characters, and while not looking like much today, this was still pretty impressive 3D animation for a video game. The story of Tekken is rooted in family rivalries. When the lead star, Kazuya Mishima, was just a boy, his father, Heihachi Mishima, threw him off a cliff to see if his son was worthy to inherit his criminal enterprise, the Mishima Zaibatsu. While surviving the fall, Kazuya suffered a huge scar across his chest and was rejected by his father, who instead adopted an orphan, Li Chaolan, to become his heir instead. 21 years later, and Heihachi announces the King of the Iron Fist tournament, where fighters all across the lands come to win its grand prize. The game features 8 characters unlocked from the start, ranging from iconic Tekken characters like Martial Law, King, Nina Williams, Yoshimitsu, and Paul Phoenix. Then there are an additional 8 unlockable clone characters who act as sub-bosses in the arcade mode. These were exclusive unlockables for the PlayStation version, but mostly featured the same movesets as their main roster rival. They would be fleshed out as full individual characters with unique movesets in later sequels. However, Kazuya Mishima is canonically the winner, with him throwing his father off the same cliff in his character's ending. What set Tekken apart from other fighting games of the time is its limb control system, where instead of the face buttons covering high and low attacks, each button was mapped to a separate limb. So you had a right punch and kick and a left punch and kick, much like controlling a puppet. Recovery times and animations were slower than regular fighting games, and it's almost impossible to try and button mash to win. This made the combat feel more technical and complex, and it works well with the replay mechanic that changes the camera angle in giving the gameplay a more cinematic approach. The stages are all based on real-world locations with the name of the place displayed at the bottom of the screen. This gives it a grounded feel despite its bonkers story and has you travelling all across the world throughout your time with it. Tekken was immensely successful, being the first PlayStation game ever to sell over 1 million copies. It was also universally praised with attention towards its combat mechanics and its large roster for the time. This was the start of one of the most important franchises for the PlayStation, and it would get bigger and better from here. Namco didn't stop with Tekken. Their fourth arcade port onto the PlayStation was released on the 10th. Sled is a tank combat game that has you piloting a futuristic hovercraft that slides along the ground, with your objective being to defeat your opponent in these 3D maze-like arenas. The game is really impressive for its time, being close to its arcade counterpart, and while the frame rate does take a hit, the tanks and arenas have a little more detail than them with some texture mapping. The game comes with different tanks to choose from, each with varying stats, but they all use the same weapons and movement. There's also a native 2-player split screen mode, which doesn't have the same texture mapped arenas as a single player mode does, but is still fun with another player, and doesn't require the link cable, which is a bonus. But outside of this, there's not really much else to see with Sled, and its 1v1 arena tank combat does become pretty repetitive after a short amount of time, and with all the vehicles playing the same, there's not much to experiment with here. The next game released on the 12th and was developed by Seibu Kaihatsu, the Raiden Project. This was the first compilation game on the PlayStation and features the arcade shoot-em-ups Raiden from 1990 and Raiden 2 from 1993. Each game features 8 vertical scrolling stages where you blast away enemies and pick up special weapons and power-ups from defeating foes. They also featured ground level troops, which made it different from the other air and space centered shooters of their time. In the first Raiden, you pilot the Fighting Thunder, an aircraft built by the invading aliens' technology, and you are the last line of defense against these alien threats. The second Raiden takes place 3 years after, and the aliens have regrouped for another attack on Earth. You have an upgraded Fighting Thunder and lead the attack against the same foes again. You can play both games in 2-player, and this PlayStation version, while being quite lacking as a compilation disc, does still come with a new CG opening cutscene, various difficulty settings, an arranged soundtrack, and compatibility with the PlayStation memory card to save your high scores. While not a groundbreaking collection, this was the best way to play these games at home, especially the second Raiden game, which was only scarcely available in arcades around that time. Also on the 12th, we got the first PlayStation game from Crystal Dynamics, Total Eclipse Turbo. This is another shoot 'em up, but a 3D space combat game that feels closer to Psygnosis' launch title Nova Storm, except now the backgrounds and terrain are all 3D rendered instead of being FMV videos. You shoot at the oncoming obstacles and enemies in the on-rails forward-scrolling stages, and you pick up upgrades that will enhance your weapons. What separates this shooter apart from the others is that your shields are constantly draining, not just through enemy fire, but also just by the passage of time. As such, you're encouraged to be constantly defeating enemies as to replenish it. However, the game can be frustrating at times as this health draining feature doesn't always work in its favour. Quite an impressive 3D shooter nonetheless, but doesn't do a whole lot that makes it memorable enough. Crystal Dynamics released their second PlayStation game on the 15th, and this too was a forward-scrolling shooter, Off-World Interceptor Extreme. Unlike Total Eclipse Turbo, you're in control of a buggy driving over rocky terrain and blasting enemies with its varying firepower. You can steer left and right, but you can't reverse and drive in any other direction than forward. You play as a bounty hunter tracking down targets for cash. Along the terrain you'll be shooting down targets and dodging environmental obstacles and other bounty hunters. Between missions you can purchase new upgrades and change your buggy. Your vehicle is equipped with jump jets that allow it to hop into the air. There are 6 different vehicles in total and each house different weapons, but easily the most bizarre part of Off-World Interceptor Extreme are its F&V cutscenes that, alongside the cheesy acting that you come to expect, have 2 characters sat in the audience breaking the 4th wall that poke fun on the cutscenes and story of the game, with it not taking itself seriously at all, and this really does make it all the more entertaining. This was a more enjoyable game than Total Eclipse Turbo, as it had better controls, a humorous narrative, and more content to see and upgrade. It was also different for a shooter at the time to mix sci-fi elements with off-road buggy action. Releasing on the 16th was a port of the incredibly popular PC shooter from id Software. Of course, I'm talking about Doom. Arguably one of the most important and influential video games of all time, and dubbed the father of first-person shooters, it led to a rise of popularity within the genre, with the following years seeing a flood of imitators. It also helped push the envelope for 3D games altogether, along with its predecessor Wolfenstein 3D. The iconic game engine built for Doom allowed it to have 3D rendered environments and abstract levels that featured revolutionary architecture for its time, such as angled walls, elevators, and transformable features that added a lot of verticality to the stage design. It was only a matter of time until it came to the home consoles, and this PlayStation version featured not only 30 levels from the original Doom, but also 23 levels from its 1994 sequel, Doom 2 Hell on Earth, and 6 brand new exclusive ones. It also featured a new musical score, sound effects, and revisioned dynamic lighting, all done to give the game a more stronger horror vibe and appeal. And it manages to work perfectly and makes this version of the game one of the most unique ports even still to this day. The game does feature a 2-player deathmatch mode, but unfortunately it isn't native and requires the link cable and a second PlayStation. But besides this small flaw, Doom on PlayStation is one of the best console ports of its day, featuring a ton of new content, completely reworked levels and sound design, and including both Doom and Doom 2 as one interconnecting experience. The battle through Mars, the demonic realms of hell, and the fight for Earth's survival as Doom Guy is still incredible fun. On the 18th, we have the first PlayStation game based on the World Wrestling Federation, which now goes by the name of World Wrestling Entertainment. Developed by Sculptured Software and published by Acclaim, this is closer to a fighting game than a traditional wrestling simulator. Moves are really over the top, combat is fast with a few combos for each character, fighters have health bars, and they are digitized into the game, capturing the real-life wrestlers performing the moves using a technique similar to Midway's Mortal Kombat series. The game comes with 8 different wrestlers to play as, with some iconic legends like Bret Hart, The Undertaker, and Shawn Michaels, and then some lesser known wrestlers like Bam Bam Bigelow, Yokozuna, and Doink the Clown. There are 2 single-player modes, Intercontinental Championship and WWF Championship. However, both are basically just arcade fighting game modes, having you battle through a set of opponents until you reach the end. Just the WWF Championship one is more difficult and features more handicap matches, which are just a mess to play. It's a lot better doing the 1v1 battles. Luckily, it does have native 2-player functionality, which is a bonus. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, was a hit when it first launched. It had some fun gameplay, impressive graphics, and a touch of comedic value that really made it feel like a project with a lot of passion put into it. Now for a few annual sports games as we draw close to the holiday season, EA kicked it off literally with FIFA 96, which released on the 22nd. This was the third entry in EA's FIFA series and was developed by Extended Play Productions, known today as EA Vancouver. This was the next generation FIFA game using a new virtual stadium game engine that, as the name implies, allowed it to feature 3D rendered stadiums to play within. And while the players are still 2D sprites, it certainly gives off a realistic 3D feel, which was really impressive for 1995. And with 3D environments, it means you also get the option for different camera angles. You also had more realistic mechanics, tons of players from many different football teams around the globe, and the best part that added to the realism was the introduction of commentary, something that is commonplace today, but FIFA 96 is where it made its debut. FIFA 96 is a huge leap in technology from its predecessors, and it certainly made it one of the most praised sports games of the PlayStation's 1995 launch period. EA followed FIFA 96 up with its professional golfing game PGA Tour 96 on the 23rd. This was the fourth game in the PGA Tour series and was developed by Hitman Productions. You have 10 different golfers to play as, and much like FIFA 96, they have pseudo 3D courses and graphics trying to capture the realism of the sport, with digitized players, really smooth animations and swings, and detailed backdrops. It does feel like you're watching a real game of golf rather than playing a PlayStation game. It was another impressive generational leap for EA's sports lineup. Now on the 24th we had another first-person shooter, Defcon 5, this time developed by Millennium Interactive and published by Psygnosis. This game mixes management systems with some first-person corridor gameplay, and has you defending and safely trying to evacuate a mining compound whilst fending off alien invaders using a myriad of control systems. You can deploy defense turrets, control the air toxicity in certain rooms, and even door controls trapping enemies, but maybe also trapping yourself. The layout of the compound is very complex and each area is linked by a subway train system. This is a slow-paced and methodical game that encourages outsmarting the enemy invaders rather than facing them head-on, but it can lead to some challenging sections where you have no idea what to do or where to go, and some tedious drawn-out moments where not a whole lot happens. Some good ideas here, but I think overall it was poorly executed and very ahead of its time. Our last PlayStation game for November 1995 released on the 28th and was a scrolling shooter known as Viewpoint. This was developed by ICOM and was yet another sci-fi shooter which there was so much of around the mid-90s. What this game does differently is that it's played from an isometric perspective with a pseudo 3D look and feel. Quite impressive visually, but ultimately this isn't the most fun to play with ridiculously high difficulty and only 6 levels before you roll credits. Again, it was another game with a few neat ideas and a pretty cool soundtrack, but not all that memorable in the long run. And those were the 13 PlayStation games that launched in November 1995. This was a packed month with some really strong titles like Tekken and Doom, some great multiplayer picks like Worms and FIFA 96, and a ton of sci-fi shooters. My game of the month has to be Doom. Just a super fun action game with some light horror elements in this version, and one of the best ports of the FPS classic. It still holds up today. Let me know your favourite game from this month in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next episode where we'll cover the final PlayStation games of December 1995. Thanks all for watching and take care.